And say writers generally get a little uneasy at the thought of public speaking. So I would appreciate if we could consider this a large conversation in which I do most of the talking. That works at home. I would like to tell you, convey to you the excitement that I felt with this book. It was one of the most enjoyable projects in my life as a writer, and certainly one of the most alien to my experience. I came across the Miss Stone case exactly 4 years ago this month. I was doing research in the New York Public Library on forensic science, which some of you may know that I usually write about contemporary crime and forensics criminology. But the history was somewhat of a departure, and I was feeling my sea legs there. And so I was working in a database of historical abstracts, entering different categories of crime, when I typed in kidnapping, and up popped the Miss Stone case, the Miss Stone affair, terrorism in the age of Roosevelt. Well, it was the story of a female missionary, a Bostonian spinster named Ellen Stone, who in 1901 was kidnapped by Macedonian revolutionaries hoping to use the ransom to finance a war of independence against the Turks. I had personally never heard of the case, and so was impelled to search a little farther, and found that this was one of the more human stories I had ever encountered coming out of the Balkans. There was one element in particular which caught my attention, and that was the fact that Miss Stone was kidnapped along with a chaperone. I thought, why would terrorists kidnap a chaperone for a hostage? And the answer is, as I learned as I went on, that these were Victorian terrorists. They were interested in being thought gentlemen and not the common variety of rogue. So the idea began to take hold that this might be a very interesting way to tell the story of an era. And so I laid aside forensic science and began Miss Stone. It turned out happily for me that there was a wealth of primary research material, cables, letters, State Department memoranda, and everyone involved, even the kidnappers, seemed to have dictated or written a memoir, which is most unusual. And I got a much more rounded picture of this than what I would have otherwise. In all, for you research buffs out there, I ended up visiting or corresponding with 13 archives, drawing on documents in 7 languages, using 4 separate alphabets. And if you want to discuss any of this during the question and answer, I will be very happy to. To introduce Miss Stone, I'd like to read a bit from the opening chapter. Ellen Maria Stone was no fragile Victorian flower. A photograph of her taken in her late teens reveals a substantial, somewhat plain young woman whose ordinary features are graced by large almond eyes, a high forehead, and a firm, determined mouth. If she ever had a suitor, she never wrote about him. On her mother's side, Nell, as she was known to family and friends, could trace her lineage back to the Plymouth colony. Her paternal grandfather was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. His son served in the same regiment, later recruiting a company of his own to fight in the War of 1812. Reared to the tattoo of a battle drum, Ellen was as patriotic as she was devout. Had she been a man, she would certainly have become a soldier. All 4 of her older brothers, in fact, were soldiers. 2 participated in the Civil War. Instead, she received a call, what she felt was a call from God, to serve as an evangelical missionary in the Balkans. And in 1878, she was posted to Bulgaria. Now, Bulgaria at that time was in a state of considerable turmoil. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the Balkans for the preceding 500 years, was crumbling. And although Bulgaria had only recently received its nominal independence, the Bulgarians' cultural cousins to the south of Macedonia were still trying to throw off Muslim rule. So the presence of American missionaries tended to actually inflame an already tense situation. I'd like to read a passage which I think gives you a good snapshot of Ottoman Europe at that moment and some idea of the relationship between the American Protestants and the Turkish Sultan. In the harbor and the sweeping Crescent Bay beyond, warships of the great powers dropped anchor. On the Sultan's birthday, fountains of fireworks burst from their decks, lighting up the headlands. The great walls of Salonika had stood for 20 centuries, encircling first a Greek city, then a Roman city, which for a time became a free city, and then a Byzantine city. Axes and shovels chipped away at the old fortifications, which were now too confining for progress. The ancient stones which were being used to modernize the quay. European money built railroads linking the Ottoman Empire to Belgrade and Paris. Café Chantant presented Viennese operas by the glow of gaslight. Electricity was not permitted since, it was said, the Sultan had confused dynamo with dynamite and considered it subversive. The Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, was a recluse. His own subjects never saw him except on Fridays when he climbed into an enclosed carriage and rode a few yards to pray at the mosque just outside the palace gate. If they strained, they could catch a glimpse of a sunken, hawk-nosed man with haunted eyes and artificially blackened hair. Custom did not permit the Sultan to show signs of mortality. In place of the sable robes of his forebears, Abdul Hamid sported a stamboline, an ugly black frock coat worn by Ottoman gentlemen to proclaim their Europeanization. Early in his reign, Abdul Hamid tolerated the Protestant missionaries. He perceived their arrival antagonized the Eastern Orthodox as well as the Roman Catholics, and anything that set Christians to fighting among themselves worked to his advantage. But as the revolts among his Christian subjects grew, the Sultan's rule became increasingly harsh, culminating in massacres. He suspected correctly that American evangelicals were encouraging rebellion in Armenia and elsewhere. Spies followed the Protestants, recording their comings and goings and confidential reports to the palace. It was roughly this state of affairs, then, against which the Stone story unfolds. On September 3rd, 1901, Ellen Stone was leaving a retreat in the mountain town of Bansko in Macedonia, traveling in the companionship of an entourage of Christian friends, when they stopped for a picnic by a babbling brook and had just repacked their belongings when they were suddenly attacked by a band of 30 armed men, sent scrambling into the stream soaking through their large skirts and petticoats, common at the time, of course, and they were driven up a mountainside and into captivity. The Stone affair, as it would come to be known internationally, was the first instance of an American citizen being captured on foreign soil, and hence America's first modern hostage crisis. The nearest thing in American experience that could count as a precedent was the capture of American sailors in the 18th and early 19th century by Barbary pirates off the coast of Africa. In that situation, of course, the kidnapping, the victims became part of a larger negotiation over treaties, over boundaries, over gifts and subsidies, and they were in fact imprisoned for 10 years before they were finally released. The Stone situation raised in a more immediate set of conflicts or questions for the Roosevelt administration. Did the American government negotiate with terrorists? Did we ever pay ransoms? Was there ever a situation in which a military intervention was justifiable? Now, Theodore Roosevelt, as many of you doubtless know, was eager to show off the expanding power of the American Navy, but this was an awkward situation. Bulgaria, which was the country thought to be sponsoring the terrorists, was landlocked except for ports in the Black Sea, and therefore sending in the fleet would mean having to fly in the face of international treaty. They would have to go through two sets of straits on either side of Constantinople, and doing that, even if we had the brass to do it, would have angered some of our allies, like Great Britain. At the heart of the story, of course, is the experience of the women in captivity. Their physical privation and the hardships they incurred being dragged over mountains by ponies in the dead of winter. The kidnappers kept them constantly on the move to keep them ahead of the Ottoman Turks. There was the psychological torment of being held every day in dark rooms, not being able to talk above a whisper. And of course, there were just the practical discomforts of captivity, which we don't often think about. It's Stone and Silke were captured with nothing but the clothes on their backs, no toiletries, no change of undergarments, and Miss Stone was in the awkward position of having to explain this to their captors, which must have been a very awkward conversation for people of that day and time. The women ended up eventually wearing men's undergarments and sharing a single bar of soap for half a year, 6 months. And whenever I say this to a mixed company, the reaction breaks down along gender lines. Women are, and men are like, what? The Stone case is also the story of the strange affection which grew up between the captives and their captors, something which we today would call the Stockholm Syndrome, and we can discuss this at much more length in the Q&A. Silke was also 5 months pregnant at the time of her capture, something which passed right by the kidnappers because her condition was hidden by loose traveling garments. And in closing, then I would like to read a passage describing that incident. As it begins, Mrs. Silke is already in labor in a cold mountain cabin, and the kidnappers at that point are frantic because there is a highwayman's superstition that evil will befall the man who causes harm to come to a pregnant woman or her child. To ward off catastrophe, then, the kidnappers sent away to a nearby village for an elderly woman whom they supposed must have some experience in birthing babies. But as it turns out, she was a half-wit, and neither she nor Miss Stone, had any experience at all in delivering babies. The old Baba appeared so backward that Silke guessed she had never met anyone outside her own family. While she may have some experience in midwifery, her best advice was to sprinkle sacred water on the mother and have her blow into a tin box. As twilight approached, the old woman sat by the fire, nursing her knees and shaking her head as a sign of approaching calamity. Katarina Silke would have to deliver her own baby. She later recalled, "I was standing now with both hands tightly clutched at the rings of a large wine cask. My strength was gone, and yet there was no one to help me." By 10 in the evening, it was over. Mrs. Silke had given birth to a baby daughter. She named the infant Elena after her mother and, of course, Miss Stone. The kidnappers are, of course, very relieved at this outcome, and they're also engagingly shy and curious about the child. You have to remember that these men were on the run, and some of them had wives, some of them had children, and they had been denied the comforts of domesticity for nearly 6 months. And so all of a sudden, a baby is born into their presence. And they're totally in love with the child. They pass her around from man to man. They chuck her little cheeks and write her name, inscribe her name on the gun stocks. 2 or 3 hours after the baby's birth, the rebel chieftain comes around to pay his respect to the mother. Things are still a little tense at that point because both Silke and Miss Stone thought that they might want to kill the baby rather than risk her cries alerting the Turkish patrols. He, the chieftain, walked over to the fire where he stood as if deep in thought. The newborn's cries seemed to startle him. Everyone else kept still. Finally, Miss Stone broke the tension by picking up the baby and handing her to him. At first, he appeared confused and embarrassed. But Silke later recalled as he watched the helpless little morsel in his strong arms, a smile passed over his face. He now made up his mind to have a good time, so he sat down by the fire and began to warm the baby's feet. The chief seemed concerned that the baby might catch cold, and so he handed the child back to Miss Stone, asking her to draw up a list of necessities. He returned shortly with barley, prunes, sugar, and tea. Silka drifted off to sleep, then awoke suddenly and wasn't able to find her baby. Then she saw the chief as he sat near the fire with his back to her. His head was nodding as he dozed. Alinchi was sleeping in his arms. Katerina Silka thanked God that there was gentleness in the man. I'm happy to take questions from the floor.
Well, the obvious question is, what happened?
Yes.
The obvious question is, what happened?
The ultimate outcome, fortunately, was a happy one for the women. I should mention that the response to the case received in the press was huge. I mean, Americans were very concerned about this. You must realize that the transatlantic cable was complete in 1866, so news could travel instantaneously from continent to continent. And so you would get the kind of immediate action-reaction situation that characterizes modern crises. And so the yellow press caught on to the story. It was daily headlines, both in Europe and America, actually. And the American people's heart ached for the hostages. And they looked to the government to do something. But Roosevelt, who was had only recently assumed office after the assassination of President McKinley, was unable to see his way clear to pay the ransom, which was an enormous sum, 25,000 Turkish lira. At that period in time would have been the equivalent of $1 million, contemporary standards. He didn't want to set that precedent, so he shifted the responsibility to the Missionary Society, who themselves did not want to pay the ransom because then it would leave, they felt, all of their missionaries in the field, vulnerable to captivity. It would become a cottage industry among kidnappers. So eventually what happened when the American people realized that neither the government nor Miss Stone's missionary colleagues were going to fork over the ransom, they began a public subscription campaign of massive proportions. Ministers were cajoling parishioners from the pulpit to give. Children were emptying piggy banks into the collection plates. Western Union, people were donating their time to go around and make individual solicitations from door to door in New York, among other places. And so the American public on its own raised about half of the money necessary to free the captives. And so a ransom was paid. But it turns out that this American had indeed paid ransoms before in the Barbary situation, and we just tried to keep a low profile. You know.
Would you expand a little more about your research, the 4 languages and the archives and so on?
Yes, I'm actually very happy to do that. My research assistant, Mervyn Kaiser, is here this evening, and we're kind of through the wars together. When I first undertook the book, it was my feeling that I could do it. There was a sufficient body of information in the National Archives and Library of Congress. From the State Department aspect, it was very carefully recorded there. Also, in Boston, I did a considerable amount of work there in the missionary archives at Harvard. And it seemed to me that it was possible to do this with only the English language documents. But as my interest in the situation grew, I realized that I would need to get Bulgarian language documents from the Central Archives in Sofia, which meant sitting from my desk in New York trying to network to find a Bulgarian who was reliable and scholarly and whom I trusted to do this work for me. So I found a wonderful woman, actually through connections from the American Farm School in Thessaloniki, Greece, And that connection was made through the internet, frankly. So she did a wonderful job. It turns out many of the documents among the diplomats were translated into French, which I could handle. But the discipline memoranda were in the language of the given country, so I had to rely upon translators. The more challenging situation was to find a researcher who could translate Ottoman documents of the period, because the Ottomans wrote, the formal language of the court was called Osmanlika, and it's now a dead language, so you can't go to a cafe in Istanbul and ask for volunteers. You need a dedicated scholar with references. And fortunately, I managed to do that through the NYU faculty. They turned me on to a lovely young man who is now working on his doctorate. And that was another one of the wonderful things about this book. It did take me so far afield. I made a sweep in the summer of 2000, I believe, through Istanbul, Sofia. We went into the highlands, into the mountainous area where Miss Stone was kidnapped, and then down through Greece, where there's a substantial archive at the farm school in Thessaloniki. And the expansion, the friendships, actually specifically the friendship with the Muslim researcher was very interesting to me, because he was very modern in his views. His parents were both educators, seemed to relate very easily to Westerners, and we had a very warm emailing association until 9/11. And actually, I did get a very concerned email from him asking if everyone was safe. Where were we? And I responded that we were fine, the city was entirely calm. But after that, there was a long silence, and I realized when I picked up the association with him again by email that he was much colder and very much had sided with his co-religionists in this situation. And it was strange. Somebody I felt I had come to know so well, and we were driven apart by politics. I guess it's not unsurprising that he should go with his co-religionists, but it did leave me feeling very strange. And I thought how it harkened back to the situation in the Stone crisis. Americans who had never met an Armenian, who had no cultural ties to Armenians save Christianity, could get very angry at the massacres in just the idea that Turks, Muslims who were massacring Christians was enough to get young boys to put down their plows and go to war. And given that we had that kind of knee-jerk affinity in that period of time, it's not surprising at all that I think Goldston felt that way.
Did you speak to any of the descendants on either side, either the kidnappers or Silka?
Yes, in fact, that was one of the most delightful aspects of this. I thought perhaps access to Stone's descendants might be more readily come by than Silka's. It turned out that was wrong. Stone's descendants weren't eager to cooperate with this book. But I was following up in kind of a minor lead. I had seen a reference in an earlier scholarly work on a Richard Cochran, who was then at Notre Dame University, who had contributed a program to the scholar who had done this work. And so just half-heartedly, or not half-heartedly, but as an afterthought, I called him, left a message, and he called back very excited. And he said, well, yes, I can give you the program, but you do realize that I'm related to Mrs. Silka. It's one of the moments you live for as a nonfiction writer, for that kind of connection to be made. And Richard was not only voluble and articulate, he in fact is an archivist, now at Ferris State University in Michigan, and had a wealth of material on his own family, old photos, letters, things I would never have found otherwise. And it struck me, as it so often does, how much of what we do is serendipity, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Actually, Richard is going to be coming out to the East Coast to visit, or to meet for the first time, a set of relatives in New Jersey, which I have met and he hasn't, and it stands to be a very interesting encounter.
I guess this is another obvious question, but having worked with, written about long dead people and recently dead people, which do you prefer?
Actually, I think one of the reasons this story was a delight is that the canon was closed. You know, they're not breaking hourly news stories on it. I know in the preceding books I've done, in two cases, Missing Beauty and the memoir with Marcia Clark, the cases were still unfolding, and it's very stressful to be doing a book about a case that is still in the making, and it is conversely enjoyable to be working with a set body of documents. And there are limitations, of course. If you have living sources to talk with, they can expand upon a point where you seem to have a gap in the documents. When you're dealing with subjects long dead, of course, you don't have that advantage. But I think, as Barbara Tuchman once said in biography, what's there is there, and what isn't, isn't. And that's part of the ground rules. And I found those very comfortable rules by which to play.
From a historical point of view, can you tell us what happened to the captors and to their rebellion and to their movement?
Yes, very interesting. After the women were released, of course, there was a hue and cry in America to go after the captors, but we were so hampered by lack of intelligence, on-the-ground intelligence from the region, that nobody could figure out who they were. Most Macedonians knew who they were because they were national heroes, but the American State Department didn't figure it out for 20 years, and so they went essentially unpunished. And in fact, they revealed themselves when, some quarter of a century later, they dictated their memoirs to historians of the Bulgarian Macedonian movement. And by that time, of course, there was no will on the part of the American public or military to go after them because they were middle-aged men by then. Actually, it's very interesting. Their memoirs showed more of a sense of humor about the incident, or the little things about the incident that struck them. It's funny, they were as serious young revolutionaries, and the group who kidnapped Miss Stone were, in fact, socialists, or the socialist wing. They had not much of a sense of humor about themselves, but in middle age, they could look back on it and say, oh, yes, yeah. When we captured Miss Stone, she wanted to go back and pick up her umbrella, and nobody knew how to stop her. Revolutionaries who are totally cowed by their captives, and that was the situation through much of the captivity. Miss Stone was a very strong personality. And I think they were afraid at one point she would martyr herself in the Christian sense, and then they would have a real mess on their hands. But she informed them, I have no intention of putting myself at liberty. You have taken my God-given freedom, now it's up to you to restore it. And they pretty much danced to her tune on a day-to-day basis.
Where did they fit into the politics of the time?
In the Balkans, from about the early 1800s, 1820s, on to the end of the century, there had been the movement among Christian states who were under Ottoman Turkish rule for liberation. So the wars of liberation were moving roughly from west to east. And at the time of the kidnapping, it was Bulgaria's time to gain her independence, which she did. The Russians and Bulgarians, who were allies at the time, envisioned a much larger Bulgarian state, which stretched down to the Aegean Sea. Russia, you realize, is landlocked, needed a warm water port, and so they were eager to see that greater Bulgaria, but the European powers didn't want to allow Russia that kind of latitude, and so they arbitrarily lopped the lower half of Bulgaria off and kept it Macedonia, which was a source of much grief and heartache to the Macedonians there. And so they had, there was a larger committee in Sofia in Bulgaria, which was the fundraising arm and hoped to lead the movement to free Macedonia from the Muslims. But in fact, it was the internal organization, which was a much more radical group. It was IMRO, Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, which really took over the revolution there. And it was considered a huge coup for them to have gotten this ransom. And they, far from being scolded by fellow Macedonians, they were in fact elevated to the status of folk heroes. And so they received the money in gold bullion. And if you've read the book, you know there was quite a great deal of fuss in getting this money from the Ottoman Bank in Constantinople over 400 miles of wild, bandit-ridden territory in order to pay it under the table to the revolutionaries, because the Ottomans wanted, in the worst sort of way, to find these men and to bring them to justice. But the Americans knew that the captives would be killed if that were the case. So finally, the ransom was paid, and they succeeded in a public relations coup, and of course were better funded. But ultimately, their conflicts within their own organization caused them to war against one another, and they used up all of the ransom on internal bickering. And ultimately, the revolution fell. They fell with it. Anyone here like to know about the Stockholm Syndrome? Yes. That was one of the fascinating things to me, how you could be held day to day. And this was 6 months they were with these captors under a death sentence most of the time. Toward the end, the situation got a little less lethal. But how the women went from being terrified captives, in effect, to being comrades of their kidnappers. And it does recall the situation in the Stockholm Syndrome. If any of you are familiar with that, in the early 1970s, there was a bank holdup in Stockholm, and 4 bank employees were held hostage for, I think, 131 hours in a bank vault. During that time, they so identified with their captors that once they were released, they testified in their behalf at the trial and actually raised money for their release. So there's been a great deal of study about what goes on psychologically when someone is captured. In this case, the women were held for 6 months. And apparently the child was born, the mother was 5 months along when they were kidnapped, and the baby was born in January. So they gained hostages, a net number of hostages in the process. But by that time, there was an attempt to free them that was launched by the Bulgarian government, because they were taking a great deal of heat internationally. And the women, according to their own memoirs, were terrified of the Bulgarians who would free them, because it would destabilize the situation and provoke their captors into killing them, which apparently is one thing that marks the Stockholm Syndrome. And after they were released, neither one of the women would say a bad thing about their captors. The American public had hoped that they would not only reveal the identities, but talk about their horrible ordeal. But Miss Stone, surprisingly, in her lecture tours after the fact, spoke up for them until her missionary colleagues told her she had to cool it.
Did Miss Stone have a first name?
Yes, Miss Ellen Maria Stone.
As media stars? Media stars.
It's media stars, yes. One of the very interesting aspects to the case is the jockeying for literary rights. Even before they were rescued, or they weren't rescued, they were handed over. Hearst, Pulitzer, S.S. McClure of McClure's Magazine sent in emissaries to the backwaters of Macedonia offering to bid on their rights, the rights to their story. We tend to think that this is a very modern situation or modern syndrome, but in fact it was quite common around the turn of the century, selling rights. Instead of book and film, you would get magazine series, a series of magazine stories, and lecture bookings. And Miss Stone commanded a whopping price of $500,000 for her lecture, and I think 52 lectures and a set of 6 magazine pieces, which ran as a serial in McClure's. But interestingly, she was not a great success as a lecturer. One, because she refused to name names, and people suspected her loyalties. And two, she was a very earnest woman and a temperance worker, and she used the podium as a means of talking against tobacco and alcohol, and that put audiences to sleep. Mrs. Silka, on the other hand, had what we would call star quality. She could tell a story. She was a wonderful writer, and in fact, that's one of the inspiring things about this book. This was a woman who came from a wealthier part of the peasant class, but still the peasant class. And she was educated because her mother insisted. You know, this one stubborn mother. In fact, there was a wonderful letter in Richard Cochrane's collection about how Katerina's mother had revolutionized their household. And she really did. She instilled in this woman a love of learning that brought her to America eventually to study. And she learned English very fluently, wrote a beautiful memoir, which again avoids laying the blame anywhere, but it was a beautiful lyrical gift that she had, and a gift which went largely unrecognized because of the time and the place. I was very happy to get her unauthorized memoir, unpublished, I should say, from the archives that her nephew had.
Did the way the story was told at the time fit in any way with the tradition of the captivity narrative? It sounds like a break from it.
No, the captivity narrative from the Barbary pirate period had a certain titillating quality. Again, women were never very particular. I mean, there were some women on these ships that were either, camp followers there in some capacity, and people were very curious for the particulars, and so they stopped just short in each time. Miss Stone's narrative didn't satisfy that requirement, and I think that was one reason why she didn't succeed. Now, Katerina Silka didn't either. It was definitely a G-rated performance, but she was so alive and so beautiful. She was quite photogenic, and she brought the baby along with her. The baby, was 15 months old at the time, would totter out on the stage. Crowds would go wild. You know, they'd pick the baby up, you know, talk about the events of her being born in captivity. And so she was a much more successful package. But it's interesting that she also was talking the line, the political line of the revolutionaries. And nobody seemed to fault her for that. They just edited it out of the presentation. She was such a visual delight.
Hi. Macedonia is now an independent country for 12, 13 years, and countries need heroes. And I wonder if these kidnappers are known. to contemporary Macedonians, and do they regard them as heroes?
Oh, absolutely. To this day, there was a plaque erected in the 20th century saying, here, and they named the kidnappers, performed the feat of kidnapping Ellen Stone, the American missionary. It was Miss Stone herself, I'm sorry, Mrs. Silka, when she would go back to this little town of Bansko, where she had relatives, her family lived there, would tell the story over and over again by the firelight, and it became part of the folk legend. And of course, it was entirely okay with her fellow Macedonians that the kidnappers had to resort to felony, essentially. They weren't felons at all. Okay.
We have time for maybe one or two quick questions. I've read the book, and I was really interested in the hints of the complicity of the Silkas in the whole thing. But I'd like to hear more about the evidence of that, because you sort of touch on it, but you don't go into it deeply, and maybe that's because there wasn't evidence. I don't know, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Yes, the Silkas, Katerina and her husband Grigor, both were very loyal Bulgarians and Bulgarian patriots, and sympathized with the Macedonian cause, but they were also Christian converts and had dual loyalties, one to the cause and to Christianity, or to Protestantism. It's very interesting. At the time, being a Bulgarian Orthodox practitioner was the same as being a patriot. And so people like the Silkas, who left the Orthodoxy to become Protestants, were under suspicion of not being patriots. What I feel happened in this case, the State Department was convinced that the Silkas were involved in the kidnap planning. I feel that was not the case. I feel if they knew what was coming down, they spoke against it. In fact, most of the Revolutionary Committee in Macedonia opposed a deed as foul as kidnap, but necessity forced them to it. The Silkas, I don't think, would ever have agreed to it. They were had very noble spirit. Also, Katerina was 5 months pregnant, and I should mention that during her time with her family in the little mountain village from which they left, she had lost a baby boy at infancy to a childhood disease. So she buried a child literally hours, days before leaving the city, the town, and being kidnapped. So it seemed unlikely to me that the Silkas could have envisioned a situation where she would be taken captive herself. Now, what happened was that when the kidnappers envisioned a chaperone, they were thinking of an elderly woman who would lend propriety to the event. And that woman was so shocked and overtaken by the event that she collapsed and was unable to serve as a chaperone. So they recruited Katerina Silka on the spur of the moment. I believe that they knew about it but couldn't do anything to stop it.
One more quick question. I have a question. What's your next book?
Well, actually, the forensic science book, the history is still pending, but I have another history in mind, another eccentric small history.